let me summarize what we studied today. So having gone through all these approaches, now it's time to apply those approaches to real substantive issues, from trade to international finance, to debt problems, to technology transfer, right? So these substantive issues will follow. Now, about trade, I think relatively long chapter, but these are the main points for this class. I think this chapter begins by saying that, you know, this topic is the most debated issue among IP issues, right? He says that no topic is more quintessential IP than trade, right? Most important issue. Now, the first question I think we have to address today is, where is global trade going today? That's the first question. The status of global free trade today, where is it going, right? And which approaches explain better today's global trade, right? Is it neoliberal, economic liberals better, or mercantilist perspectives explain better, or structuralist perspectives explain better, right? But this chapter, there are several important points. First, I think if you read this chapter, global trade today has increased or decreased compared to the past? Has increased or decreased? Increased. That's first thing I think we should learn from this chapter. So global trade in general is going okay, smoothly, because it has expanded over time. Although there are ups and downs, right? But global trade today faces many problems. Many problems. One problem, I think probably the biggest problem facing global trade is global trade today, although it has expanded, it is now being stalled, deadlocked. Global trade today has become a bilateral issue rather than multilateral. So multilateral trade negotiations on a global scale is not going smoothly, right? So global trade has transformed into a regional or bilateral type of negotiation, which is highly problematic. So we are not sure whether global trade from now on will continue to expand or will shrink. We are not sure at the moment, if you look at this current state, right? So there must be some real fundamental problems in the structure of global trade. And we need to go back to those approaches we have covered in part 1 of this textbook, right? Either liberal, mercantilist, or structural. Which perspective explain better today's global trade, right? Now, second point. Having said this, there is a resistance, right? There is a resistance from the developing countries, right? Against, regarding the global trade, there is a resistance. Because global trade is still the agenda for advanced countries, right? Agenda for advanced countries. So developing countries, they resist this advanced countries' agenda. The key question is, I think key question comes down to the gains from trade, the debate on the gains from trade. Okay? Whether or not there are gains from trade. Okay? And liberals, mercantilists, structuralists, they have all different views on this key question regarding the gains from trade. Right? Liberals say gains from trade, clear and present. Okay? Clear and present. There are clear and present gains from trade for everyone involved. Right? That's liberals' view. Mercantilist view, they half accept the gains from trade, the notion of the gains from trade. But the gains from trade are not equally distributed. That's mercantilist view. But they accept the notion of the gains from trade. Okay? So mercantilists argue the state must step in to make sure these, right? The theoretical gains from trade can go equally to everyone involved, right? That's mercantilist view. Structuralist view, they negate the gains from trade. Okay? And what is important to provide the evidence for the gains from trade. Different people provide different types of evidence, data, right? This textbook, different scholars provide different numbers, right? Different numbers. So we need to get to those issues of evidence. And I think this chapter goes through some historical evolution of global trade, right? So, in the contemporary era, the multilateral global trade negotiation began with the setup of, right, the GATT, right? Then GATT sort of became much more institutionalized WTO. And both these trade organizations have different rounds of negotiations, right? Different rounds of negotiations have different outcomes for global trade. Some rounds were much more successful than others, right? So we need to go through which round was more successful in lowering trade barriers. So we need to discuss that. And in terms of things that are obstructing global trade, right? There are issues that really hinder, right, global trade. There are important issues that hinder global trade. What are those, issues that hinder global trade? Agriculture is one of those problems, and there are other, new issues that have emerged, like intellectual property rights, and all those different issues. Okay, then I think we can handle each section. I think this chapter begins with the book by Thomas Friedman, right? As a New York Times columnist, he wrote a couple of books, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. Then the second one, what was the second one? The World is Flat, right? One of the key arguments he made in this book is that he argues that the global process of production has changed dramatically, right? So trade and production, this is the theme of this chapter, right? Trade and production. Different countries have different production systems, right? And he argues the global production process has changed dramatically in a way that he says that the current production system is much more fragmented. So fragmentation is one character. Fragmentation. Today's production system at a global level is much more fragmented rather than unified. Fragmented rather than unified. And second, much more specialized. So fragmented, specialized, outsourced. I think these three terms define the new type of production system. Fragmentation, specialization, outsourcing. This is Friedman's argument in his book. And how this affects, right? Right, global trade, right? That's his following argument. How this affects can anyone answer what all this means? Fragmentation and specialization and outsourcing, according to Friedman, that define the current production system. That might affect trading system also.
Globalization.
Yeah, due to globalization, yes. Due to globalization, production is much more fragmented, specialized, outsourced. What does this mean? How are goods produced in systems like this? Fragmented system, how are goods produced? Or how are services, right? How are services provided? How are goods produced? That's the question, right? And the way goods are produced, the way services are produced, as provided, according to Friedman, very different today. Qualitatively different due to globalization, right? The world is much more globalized, so that production is different, right? The way goods are produced different. By definition, this is the definition of international trade. Okay? International trade occurs when goods and services across national boundaries. Okay? This is the definition of international trade. In fact, most of goods and services produced and consumed locally. Okay? But more and more goods and services are produced across national borders, right? So international trade has grown dramatically. More and more goods and services are produced and consumed internationally. I know the number for energy. Probably different commodities have different numbers for this. Oil and gas produced, consumed locally 70%. Oil and gas, okay? And only 30% are put on the market for trade. That's oil and gas. Maybe other commodities might have different numbers, a little bit of different numbers. So production has been internationalized. This is what this means. This is how much trade has increased. Okay, over 1960, as of 2006, the trade amount $23 trillion. Okay, over $62 billion in 1960. But there is tension between nations over trade. They have different views on trade. I think the page 162, different views on trade let me repeat. The liberals' view, mercantilist view, and structuralist view on trade. Like I said, mercantilist view, the liberal views on global trade is they accept the gains from trade for liberals, okay? But for liberals to maximize the gains from trade, what is most important? What is most important for liberals is set of rules and regulations for liberals. To maximize gains from trade, set of rules and regulations is important, and institutions. For mercantilists, mercantilists agree that there are economic gains from trade. But a variety of views on how trade contributes to national wealth and power. Okay? It could either undermine or promote national wealth and power. So the state must step in to make sure trade contributes to national power and wealth. So the point for mercantilists is trade is a much more complex issue, right? Much more complex than liberals think. That's what mercantilists think. And I think if you look at the history of international trade, I gave you a little bit of summary regarding the state of global trade today. Global trade today has become very complex because global trade there are two aspects of global trade. Okay? Global trade between the advanced countries, right? Relatively simple, although there is still tension between advanced countries, but relatively simple between advanced countries. But global trade between advanced countries and developing countries, much more complex. And the reason today's global trade has become much more complex is that unlike in the past, more and more developing countries get involved in global trade, right? So tensions over trade has become much more complex because of that, the involvement of developing countries. So if you look at the data, more and more developing countries, they get involved in global trade, okay? Which makes global trade much more complex to get developing countries, poor countries involved. That's why WTO system is being stalled because of that. So the issues between advanced countries and the issues between advanced countries and developing countries, we need to look into that. What different issues over trade, right? And structuralists, they look much more carefully into, right, advanced country and developing country relations. Right? And they argue the gains from trade for developing countries, nothing. That's what structuralists argue. Right? Okay. Get to a little bit of history of global trade. Because global trade has right, long history, right, topsy-turvy history of cooperation and conflict, protectionism and liberalism. So we'll get into that. So we don't need to cover, we don't need to repeat those different perspectives on trade, right? Structuralism, liberalism. This is a repeat of previous pages. So you go ahead and read again these pages on three perspectives. Then go straight to how GATT came into being. Page 166. How GATT came into being, was founded after World War II, and before GATT, ITO, International Trade Organization. How ITO, International Trade Organization, failed, then GATT replaced ITO. So ITO failed to be born, right after World War II, and because of coalition of nationalist interest in the U.S. Congress, so ITO failed. Then instead, GATT 1948 was founded. General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And usually GATT evolved in a way that there are a series of meetings, right? There are high-level meetings, which is called rounds, right? There are several rounds. There have been several rounds of multilateral trade negotiations, high-level meetings over trade. Two principles. There are two principles. Reciprocity. Two principles crucial to the GATT system. One is reciprocity. Reciprocity is sort of if you lower trade barriers to one country, and that should apply to every other country. That's reciprocity. Okay, so you should not lower trade barrier to country A and raise trade barrier to country B. That's not possible under the GATT system. Okay, so reciprocity principle, you have to lower trade barriers together. Non-discrimination. Okay, non-discrimination. Again, similar, imports from all trade are treated the same. This is otherwise called MFN. Non-discrimination is called, otherwise called, most favored nation principle. In terms of membership, the former Soviet bloc countries, were they members of the GATT? No. Right? They refused to join. Some limitations of GATT. There were some limitations of GATT. Enforcement mechanism was too weak. That's one problem. There was no enforcement mechanism. Right? So even under GATT rules, some nations, they were not always willing to grant these two key principles, reciprocity and non-discrimination. Okay? So in no other way they could enforce these rules. And consensus problem, consensus system. It was consensus system. So because of that principle, it was problem with implementation. Right? There was no implementation. So sometimes political interest dominated because of this. powerful countries, right? They drive their own agenda. And exceptions. There were exceptions, right? There were a series of exceptions, particularly on these two issues, right? Textile issue, agricultural issue. And these two industries were still protected, even under the GATT system. And tariffs and quota were allowed on these two industries. These were exceptions. And later, under the WTO system, we have to see how these textiles and agriculture issue will remain as problems, right? We have to see. Right, I mean, this will come up later again. One other exception to the GATT was, again, regional agreements, regional trade agreements that was like outside the boundary of the multilateral organization, which has become even bigger problem under the WTO system. But under the GATT system, still there were regional trade agreements, right, outside the boundary of the GATT. And regional trade agreements, which is mostly bilateral, sometimes multilateral, right, but many are bilateral, right, which goes against the principles of two key principles, reciprocity and non-discrimination. Now, let's talk about 1960s until the early 70s. 1960s and the early 1970s. The entire decade of the 60s until the early 70s are defined by protectionism. Okay? Protectionism. But the nature of protectionism at that time was not quite tariffs themselves, but not quite tariffs per se, but NTBs were problems. Okay, non-tariff barriers. So level of tariffs a little bit down, but level of NTBs up. In the form of this, subsidies, duties, dumping, government purchasing. These were the main issues at that time. And product standards. These all comprise NTBs at that time. So GATT, as an institution, as a multilateral institution, they had to, right? They had to do something about these NTBs. So looking at these issues, what would you do as a GATT? You like a summon, right? High-level meeting, right? The round, right? So after this period, the round of, right, GATT was summoned. What was it? Tokyo round was summoned, right? To tackle these issues. These are all NTBs, the issues at the time. And to tackle these issues, this round was, right, summoned. 73, 79. There were different rounds, right? Tokyo round, Uruguay round, and the more recent one, Doha round, right? And each different round have different themes, right? Tokyo Round, their issue was, right, NTB. NTBs were the issues, right? That was on the agenda at that time. And Tokyo Round, was it successful or like not failing, but was it successful, Tokyo Round, according to this? Look at this. 1963-73, okay? Despite this, NTBs, trade increased 4 times, but after Tokyo Round, still in the 70s and 80s, increased only 2.5 times, right? Because the Tokyo Round, the role of Tokyo Round was very limited, okay? Very limited. This shows the portion of trade per GDP for each country. US, the United States, 20%. So 20% of GDP comes from trade. This is what this means. Japan, almost same. Europe, 50%, very high. Europe depended on trade for economic growth. And America didn't seem to rely that much on trade, okay? The US economy was still inward looking rather than trade looking. Japan, same, only 20%. So you will see then, just looking at this, right? Some countries, they consider trade as more important issue than others, right? So Europe was much more, they think trade as much more important than Japan and the United States. But still trade among the advanced countries still source of tension, okay? Until the early 80s. I think the points I was trying to make here is trade until that time was mostly about the advanced countries, right? And despite Tokyo Round, in the trading relations among the advanced countries, trade conflicts intensified, right? So that's why they define that period as mercantilism. It's a mercantilist state, quintessentially revolving around the government policy, MITI, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, right? Right? They made strategic trade policy. Strategic trade policy, and they try to stimulate exports. The Japanese government, their goal was to expand trade exports and blocking foreign imports. Right? That was Japanese trade policy at the time, which was mercantilist policy until the early 80s. Right? Until the early 80s, when the next trade round of negotiations began, like Uruguay round, right? So until the Uruguay round, trade was still among the advanced countries, right? And Japan was most aggressive. America was also very aggressive. America was mercantilist policy. Same, the US policy, like a trademark of US policy at the time, Super 301, right? Which is casual name for this trade act, 1988. Again, same idea. they list priority countries, right, that unfairly discriminate against U.S. products. That's Super 301. They pinpoint those countries that discriminate against U.S. products, then they give penalty. That's Super 301, right? This was a reaction to Japanese trade policy. So free trade was dying because of these mercantilist policies, protectionist policies of major countries. And this is in agreement with the data, right? US and Japan, they were relatively free from trade, right? They are domestically oriented economies, right? Europe, 50% dependence, but Japan, America, only 20% dependence, right? So that's why this policy is so, right? Trade, like a discriminative policy, US and Japan. So free trade, global trade was limited because of these policies. And this is another example. The US government assisted private corporation, Microsoft, right? And according to the textbook, that's why the best way to describe free trade at that time, 70s and 80s, is a fair trade. It's not free trade. Okay, free trade was being replaced by fair trade. Now, then changes come in the 80s. Fair trade rather than free trade, like I said. And bilateral, more of the norm than multilateral. Okay? Increasing protectionism. Then Uruguay round began, 1986, and Uruguay round, compared to Tokyo round, much more successful. Okay, compared to Tokyo round, much more successful. And again, you know, this is not economics class. You learn economics from Professor Anyongdo, right? The difference between Anyongdo and me is that he would rather maybe cover same things, maybe, you know, free trade, Uruguay round, Tokyo round, everything. But the difference, the reason why this is not international trade, the course, this course is called IP. You need to consider the other, like a path of development, which like the security or political development. You know what? The times when the Uruguay round began, 1986. The times of the 1986, the early 1980s. What was the time? There was on the exam, the quiz one. Reagan administration, right? Neoliberalism began. Neoliberalism. A lot of people miss that question. Neoliberalism set in. Why neoliberalism set in? And after neoliberalism, globalization, right, began. It's not purely about economic forces. It was also about political security forces. The Soviet Union collapsed, right? America was facing unilateral, like a moment, right? You need to consider that into this trade, like considerations. And this is time when the Uruguay round began. This is time when America was becoming unilateral power, right? and neoliberalism emerging, and globalization was beginning. So we were back to liberal vision of free trade again with the launching of the Uruguay round, right? 86, in Punta del Este, which is in Uruguay, and it ran on, until December 1993. December 1993, about 7 years. Reagan administration was in power. Right? Very important point. Politically, right, Reagan administration was behind. The goal was, you know what, the U.S. government, the U.S. economy, you need to think the status of the U.S. economy, right? The U.S. economy was in a recession, right, after the energy crisis. So Reagan administration, his goal was to open markets for U.S. products, right? That was the goal. And they needed, again, another free trade type of multilateral negotiation. Recession in the United States, right? And another goal to counter Soviet influence. To counter Soviet influence, to spread out American visions. Because the US and the Soviet Union was competing, right, in the developing regions, developing countries. It was a success. Uruguay round, successful. Trade has increased. And some of the, right, problems, these NTB, non-tariff barriers problem, relieved. I mean, some of these went down. Subsidies down, quotas down, FDI up, right? So markets were being opened in developing countries, right? As Americans expected. And the globe was being interdependent, linking America, developing countries. That's what interdependence means. Developing countries more involved. They are, right, encouraged to participate. So I think this is an important moment because, like I said, before this time, global trade was about the advanced countries, right? Now global trade has spread out to involve more developing countries. Developing countries get involved. I think this is the beginning of that interdependence. And some new rules and regulations were set up. Under the Uruguay round. What are the new rules and regulations? Which is an improvement. Which is an improvement over previous rounds, Tokyo rounds and others, right? These are new rules. Uruguay round made a contribution in like putting down the rules about these. Textiles agriculture, some rules made. Okay. Market access in America and in Europe, right? Because the countries that are protecting textile industry, agriculture industry is Europe and America, right? Developing countries, they want to export their textile goods and agricultural goods to US and Europe. And Europe and America, they are protecting, right? And under the Uruguay round, America, Europe, they opened a little bit about textiles and agriculture. Some improvement over Tokyo round, right? It's the other way around, right? So developing countries asking Europe and America to open textile and agriculture. And some improvement on this. And TRIPS. TRIPS emerged again. These are new issues under the Uruguay round. TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property rights. Copyrights, patents, trademarks. Some rules were made about these issues. TRIMS. What are TRIMS? Trade-related investment measures. Okay, so developing countries, this is the demands of advanced countries, right? This is the demands from developing countries. This is the demands from advanced countries against developing countries, right? So advanced countries asking developing countries to abide by these rules. Okay? Copyrights and others. TRIMS, again, advanced countries asking developing countries to open investment areas. That's TRIMS. And trade in services. Again, this is a new development. Formerly, trade was about goods, manufactured goods. But the Uruguay round, not only in goods, manufactured goods, trade in services is becoming more and more controversial. Trade in services, like not, cars and TVs going across board this time, like a banking or lawyers or universities, right? They go abroad and penetrate the market, right? So these are new issues, trade in services. And agriculture for the first time, right? For the first time, it was formally on the agenda and some improvement under the Uruguay round, agricultural issue. It was a huge improvement. And this chapter discusses in some detail the US and Cairns Group. The US and Cairns Group they went ahead and to promise to phase out, eliminate agricultural protection under the Uruguay round. But those promises have not been delivered, have not been kept since then. But for the first time, agriculture was officially on the agenda, some improvement. Now, then, thanks to improvement under the Uruguay round ending with the foundation of World Trade Organization, 1995. Now, global trade issue has become much more institutionalized after WTO was set up. So unlike GATT system, WTO is now official international organization for the first time. It has official members and office headquarters in Geneva, and it controls 90% of world trade and secretariat. And the major goal of WTO as an official body for international trade was to implement, right, the agreements made under the GATT. That was the primary goal. And it was a forum, right, the center for negotiating new trade deals. And one difference from the previous GATT system was they have trade dispute settlement mechanism, right? Trade dispute settlement mechanism. A little bit of enforcement mechanism built into WTO. And review national trade policy. WTO, make sure that every country has appropriate trade policy and make recommendation for national governments, right, in terms of what kind of trade policy. So they review national trade policies, like IMF. IMF review financial policies of national governments, right? So WTO, they review national trade policies. And they provide technical assistance to developing countries. Again, consensus system. It is a consensus system. They have a secretariat. And every 2 years, they have ministerial conference. Every 2 years. And they have a general council. This is the structure. They have a secretariat. This is admin body, right? Council make important decisions. And ministerial conference is like a parliament every 2 years. And they have dispute settlement panel, DSP, sort of enforcement mechanism, right? So when countries have disputes, right, they bring those disputes to this panel. And this panel comes down with a decision, right? Who is right, who is wrong. And there were important decisions, important cases. Like there were disputes between U.S. and Europe over beef issue. Okay, and Europe and America, they brought this case to DSP, and DSP came down with some decision, saying, the allegations of Europe against America, they blocked imports of American beef because they have hormone contaminated, right? And DSP came out with the decision that Europeans were wrong, right? That was a decision, famous case Another one, the banana issue, right? And genetically modified organs, right? These issues. Oh, same thing. Just repeat. Now, then Doha round. I think Doha round is the first like a ministerial meeting after WTO was set up, right? It was one of those ministerial conference in every 2 years, but the ministerial conference that was supposed to be held in Seattle 1999 was so like important in a way that that meeting was canceled because of riots and protests from different people, NGOs, you know, under the banner of anti-globalization. Because of that, the Seattle meeting was canceled. Then another ministerial conference in Doha, 2001. At that time, Doha meeting was revolving around the complaints from developing countries regarding the state of global trade. The argument was this. Okay, the argument: developing countries must be included in the negotiating process. Okay, so the issue, and Doha round was nicknamed the development round because all the issues come down to this question: what do developing countries want? This is what developing countries want. Number one, they want to be included in the negotiating process. They don't want to be excluded. That's what they want first. Second, they blame WTO, okay, for failing some of the promises made under the Uruguay round. Okay, this is what the developing countries want. And even more controversial is because of WTO, they suffer more poverty. Highly controversial argument, which requires a lot of empirical evidence. They suffer more poverty because of open trade. There were damage on all counts: environmental, social, economic damage done because of free trade. This is developing countries' argument. And they resist Washington consensus. Washington consensus is problematic. Group of 20. This is not G20, different from G20. Group of 20 led by India, Brazil, China, right? They particularly blame the farm subsidies, agricultural subsidies, right, of the advanced countries. Right? Of all these issues, agriculture issue is very high on the agenda. Agriculture issue, because of the protection from the advanced countries. Poor countries, they cannot export agricultural goods, right? So agriculture is very important issue. and more access. They want more access, right? Little more on agriculture issues. America, despite empty promises, in reality they passed some U.S. Farm Bill. Because of this Farm Bill, there was overproduction in the United States, overproduction of crops. Then this overproduced agricultural goods exported, right, put on the market. Then they displace, the U.S. grains displace developing countries' products. Right? This is a problem. So U.S. rhetoric and their acts different. There is a gap. And agriculture is central to all trade negotiations because agriculture is the one that are blocking all other agreements. All other agreements. So without breakthrough on the agricultural issues, right, other issues cannot move on. TRIPS, talk a little bit about TRIPS. Under the WTO, TRIPS evolved in a way that generic medicines become much more controversial, right? Again, developing countries' argument is there is limited access to generic medicines. For health issues, for health reasons, developing countries, they want more open, right, trade of generic medicines. And advanced countries argue no, the compulsory licenses, so-called, quote-unquote, compulsory licenses, which is argued by developing countries, right? It's harmful to U.S. manufacturers and advanced countries' manufacturers. Cultural products, again, this is another issue. TRIPS, like cultural products such as movies, right? Right, I mean, more and more cultural products are being traded, right? And some countries are, I don't think, even Koreans, we have some policy of limiting, right, foreign cultural products. Every country does the same. And other, like services, like goods, including insurance companies and security firms, these are all under TRIPS issues, right? Like American insurance company opening branch here, right? That's TRIPS issue, right? Like American securities firms opening branch here in Korea, that's TRIPS issue. Banking, American, banking, like opening a branch office here in Korea, that's TRIPS issue. So these are brand new issues under the WTO, right? And they are bracketed into TRIPS issues, these issues. And to block some of these types of issues, countries, to block the access, they sort of legislate some local content legislation, right? Put down local content legislation. These are discussed under TRIPS. SNDT. What is SNDT? Special and differential treatment. Special and differential treatment rules. Again, this is another way of like limiting market access, right? Market access to developing countries. Now, in parallel with this WTO, Uruguay round, the Doha round and these multilateral negotiations, we have another development, another current of development that is regional trade blocs, regional trade agreements. More and more countries, particularly America, they push for bilateral trade negotiations, either bilateral or regional trade negotiations. So regional trade negotiations and WTO multilateral negotiations, they go in parallel, right? The reason why RTA, regional trade agreements, multiply, the reason for that is we have resistance from developing countries on multilateral issues, okay? So America pushed for the parallel mechanism, which is called regional or bilateral negotiations. And RTA today control 43% of world trade, right? As of 2000. Like I said, bilateral regional format, easier for strong countries, easier for the US to dictate, impose, right, terms. Less bureaucracy. These are beauties of RTA, advantages of RTA. These advantages for the US, less bureaucracy, in terms of portions of different regions, right, per global trade, EU accounted for 39% of global trade. NAFTA as a regional bloc, 15%, ASEAN 6%, Mercosur, Latin American trading region, only 1.6%. Right. Question is, then what are the implications of this for global trade? Right. Two divided arguments. Right. One school of thought argues still regional trade agreements are beneficial, right? Beneficial for open global trade, right? And others argue, well, the other way around. These are regional trade agreements are disadvantageous for open global trade. Let's look at first pros. RTA is good for trade, right? One school of thought argues yes. Okay. Now let's get to this Thursday. But Thursday, read chapter 7, International Finance.